I will put over to you.
Thank you, Cassie. It was a very nice introduction. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to talk to all of you. The world of Zoom meetings has become the new normal, I know. A lot different giving presentations by Zoom than in person, but I will do my best for you today. Yes, our office is kind of unique. We have 10 attorneys, and while my particular practice deals more often with people who are over the age of 65, our office also specializes in special needs and working with people who are experiencing disabilities. In fact, my partner, Melanie Marmion, is probably one of the state, if not national, experts on special needs issues. So we have that component as well. But today we're talking primarily about long-term care. And primarily, if you will, even more so about how to pay for long-term care and how all that gets funded. And of course, working with a lot of older clientele, I'm often dealing with an individual who's going into long-term care for a dementia or significant mobility issues. Sometimes I'm working with a married couple, sometimes I am not, and we'll go through all of those types of pieces. But basically, what we're going to talk about is going into long-term care and ultimately long-term care Medicaid. I know many of you already know that Medicaid covers long-term care, but you also know that Medicaid now in Oregon covers people under 65 who are just needing health insurance. And we're not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking kind of specifically about this thing called long-term care. So I certainly do welcome your questions, and we are, going to have plenty of time and at the end also for questions that you may have. But I'm going to take you through a lot of the material. I know Cassie sent out a handout that I put together, but please don't feel like you have to go through that. That's really just a piece of information for you to use, a primer, if you will, on these issues that we're going to talk about. The other thing, a couple things. Uh, we use this term long-term care, and while it's a very common term, I'm not really sure I know what the definition of that is. Really, what we're talking about is often care outside the home, or it could also be care in the home as well. And so long-term care in Oregon. And by the way, Oregon has for many, many years led the nation in options and alternatives for long-term care. And I guess I didn't tell you this ahead of time, but I've been doing this for a long time. In September, it will be my 40th year of doing this practice. But Oregon during that period of time really has led the nation, in my opinion, with options for long-term care and with the concept of being able to age in place. And I'm really proud of our state and the people who work for the state that have accomplished those things. But long-term care options you may already know about. Long-term care options are anything from the high end of a nursing home, an institutional setting where they have, nursing staff on call on a regular basis, people with significant mobility or significant cognitive impairments, and obviously the most expensive level of care. We're seeing now kind of the high end for long-term care being anywhere around $10,000 to $11,000 a month. So it's obviously very, very expensive. There are certain facilities, of course, who do specialized care like vent care and other types of care that could well exceed that substantially. Then we also have adult foster homes, which are individual homes that can have up to 5 residents. Often they are dealing mostly with cognitive impairments, but some of them are capable and specialized and able to handle particular mobility issues and other issues related to physical needs. Their average cost for long-term care $4,000 to $6,000, but again, specialized long-term care. I'm sorry, specialized adult foster homes can be much more expensive as well. Then there's residential care, assisted living, memory care, which are usually a person having their own apartment. They go down to community meals. In memory care, there may be locked doors, but in residential and assisted living, there may not be. And then finally, and those types of care needs are roughly around $5,000 to $7,000 per month. And then home care services, we would like to be able to provide home care services all the time. It's not always available or the best option for certain people, but certainly in-home care services are available and can ultimately be paid for by Medicaid. We'll talk about that as well. But in-home care services could be anywhere from a couple $100 of help daily or even monthly, all the way up to full-time 24/7 care at home, which is by far the highest and most expensive level of care. Sorry, not the highest level of care, but certainly the most expensive. And you may be looking at, anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 a month for full-time, around-the-clock in-home care services. So all of those things you probably already knew anyhow. We call those long-term care, and what they all have in common is that they're all expensive. And so most of the people that I work with, they don't have the assets available to pay for long-term care in an expensive care facility out of their monthly income. So most of them are starting to spend their assets, and their assets are starting to diminish as they're paying for long-term care. The good news is, though, that there are programs and things available to help protect people once their money runs out. And if they are a married couple, there's very good programs in place to help protect the spouse at home, let's just call it that, so that he or she does not have to become financially impoverished. And we'll talk about that piece. There's a whole separate section of the Medicaid code called the Spousal Impoverishment Provisions, and we'll discuss that specifically today. So one of the interesting things that I ask clients about, and I'll ask you as well, and you don't have to answer this, but when we think about the ways that we pay for this expensive care, there really are probably only 4 or 5 different ways that we do that. But in truth, most of them, there's only 2 ways that we pay for that. But let's talk about that next. One of the ways that people can pay for long-term care is that if they are on Medicare, not Medicaid, but Medicare. And so if you are, many of you may know this already, if you are hospitalized for up to 3 days, and then you are discharged to a skilled nursing home, then Medicare will step in and pay for that long-term care for a period up to 100 days or until the rehab stops. And so while that's a nice benefit, and it is really the only significant benefit that Medicare covers, except for some pieces of in-home services, it is still a very small percentage of the people who are in long-term care. Roughly about 5 to 7% of the people in long-term care are being covered by Medicare because they're in that situation. So a lot of people think that Medicare covers a lot of long-term care, but in truth, it does not. Medicaid is quite different. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, about 3 to 4% now we're seeing have long-term care insurance. And that's a product that used to be very prominent, but is kind of going away. But if you have long-term care insurance, or the person you're caring for does, and they're still paying for it, they still have it, hopefully that might be some protection for them. But again, it's a really small percentage of people who have it. And it's expensive coverage. And you have to be relatively healthy when you get it. So it's very difficult for people to access and get long-term care insurance after they have experienced a disability or a diagnosis. So we don't, unfortunately, get to see a lot of clients who have that as well. But it is a piece of the puzzle. So there are some people who get long-term care benefits because they were wartime veterans. That's an incredibly small piece, less than 1% of the people in long-term care. So if you're doing the math, those three things we talked about, which are, Medicare, long-term care insurance, and veterans benefits, are less than 10% of the people in long-term care. 40% of the people in long-term care are what I call private pay. They're paying for the bill, that monthly cost, that monthly check, out of their own pocket. They're paying for it until they get down to the point where they're eligible for Medicaid, which we'll talk about next. Private pay in Oregon means that you are responsible to pay for your long-term care if you're a single person. But if you are a married couple, you are responsible for each other's long-term care as well. So one of the big pieces about private pay is that they look at a married couple as being one financial unit. And so it doesn't make any difference whether he earned the income or she earned the income or they earned the income. It doesn't make any difference whether it was an inheritance that one of them received from a parent or the other, whether it was a windfall of an accident settlement or whatever it is. As long as it's in the name of one or the other of the married couple, it is, quote, quote, available for long-term care. Now, that's the bad news. A couple of pieces of good news. Children are never responsible for their parents' long-term care expenses. No one will ever come to a child and say, you must pay for your parents' long-term care. The reverse of that, though, is the state and federal government don't care one iota about the inheritance that a parent could leave to a child. They want to take care of the person who needs long-term care and their spouse, but they aren't going to help you preserve an inheritance for a child. Are there things we can do to try to make that better than that? Yes, we have some tools where we can do some estate planning that help get some money to the kids if that's your goal, but it has to be done a certain way, and we may or may not have time to talk about that today. So children are not financially responsible for their parents. But the other piece of the private pay piece is that there are protections in place for that spouse. So while they're considered one financial unit, we still have some major protections that are there to keep that spouse from becoming impoverished. And we're going to get into that quite a bit today. Okay? So about 40%, as we said, are private pay. Another 10% are Medicare, long-term care insurance, and veterans benefit. That leaves 50%, and actually it's over 50% of the people in long-term care on Medicaid. More people are paying for long-term care through the Medicaid program than they are with any other system. That is why it's so important to understand this program if you or someone in your family is headed towards long-term care. You need to know what Medicaid is. You need to know how it works. You need to know that there are people like our office and others who help clients go through this process. It is an incredibly important piece if you believe that long-term care is something that is in your future or in the future of a family member or a loved one. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, so Medicaid is a federal and state program. Most of the rules are federal rules. Most of the money comes from the federal government, comes from the same pot, if you will, as Medicare and Social Security. You've been paying into it. We're all paying into that system. However, Medicaid is a program that you don't just automatically get. You get Medicare when you turn 65 or when you have a disability. Medicaid you get when you can prove that you have a need for Medicaid. That's why it's often referred to as a needs-based program or a means, M-E-A-N-S, means-tested program. And so we're going to talk specifically about what it means to become eligible for Medicaid. But once you are eligible for Medicaid, they will pay for all long-term care expenses. They will often use the person's income, apply it to those expenses, and then they will pay everything else. With a spouse, it works a little different. There may be money shifted to the spouse as well, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. So primarily what happens is when you're eligible for Medicaid, they'll use your income to pay for your expenses, and then they will pay for everything else. So Medicaid will cover the care facility bills, room and board, pharmacy, doctor bills, medical transportation, medical supplies, medical equipment, um, tissue paper, and haircuts. I mean, pretty much everything. So that's of course necessary where you've got a single individual who's no longer has any funds and now needs to pay for long-term care. But that's also true for a couple, that they will cover all of that so that the spouse remaining at home is no longer paying for any medical bills for their other spouse once that person is on Medicaid. So that's why it's such a valuable, important program for you to know about. Okay? So then the big question really becomes, how do you become eligible for Medicaid? And as I said before, you don't just automatically get it. You have to prove that you have a need for Medicaid. And I refer to it as passing 3 different tests. There are 2 financial tests and 1 healthcare test. And you have to pass all 3. And that's true whether you are a single person or whether you're a married person, but the test changes a little bit for both. So the first test that we talk about is the healthcare test, if you will. It's called the service priority level. You don't have to remember that. But basically, Medicaid has a rule that says if your healthcare need is not significant enough, we are not going to give you Medicaid. And what they're really saying is your ability to take care of yourself is very, very poor, and you need someone to assist you. So they're really looking at your level of assistance, your ability to take care of your own ADLs or not. And you're all, I think, familiar with the term ADLs, but activities of living are, dressing, bathing, mobility, elimination, which are bathroom issues, eating, and cognition. And of course, with ALS, you see a lot of mobility issues, elimination issues, maybe even eating issues. We see a lot of eating issues with Parkinson's, and then cognition is an issue that you can see at any plane. So Medicaid is looking at all of those different pieces. To be eligible for Medicaid, though, you have to, and what they do is they basically come out and evaluate your situation, how much assistance you need. And dressing and bathing assistance are usually not enough to get you access to Medicaid. They actually have a scale they put you on from level 1 through 18. And you actually have to pass level 13. Well, let me step back. This gets a little confusing. It's kind of a strange way that they create this scale because level 1 is the highest level of care. Someone who is completely immobile, perhaps has cognitive issues as well, cannot do anything for themselves, would be a level 1 on this scale that Medicaid creates. And then a level 18 is someone who might need a little bit of help with dressing and bathing. To be eligible for Medicaid, you have to be level 1 through 13. It used to be all the way up to level 17, but Medicaid kicked it back down in the late 90s. So that level 1 through 13 is eligibility. And that basically means that you have a significant need of assistance because of mobility. And I describe mobility in my West Fitzwater unofficial test to clients as, can that person get themselves out of bed by themselves at night, walk to the bathroom, take care of bathroom issues, which is the elimination piece, walk back to the bedroom, get back in bed by themselves without assistance most of the time. And if that's the case, they probably don't meet the mobility standard. But certainly, if they do need assistance occasionally, that starts to go up. If they need assistance all the time, they would meet that standard. If they can't take care of bathroom issues by themselves, need help, they would meet the elimination standard. If they can't bring a spoon to their mouth, they don't meet the eating standard. Or if they have swallowing issues, they do meet the eating standard. If they just need somebody to fix meals for them, but they can feed themselves, they do not meet the eating standard. And then finally, cognition is really all about the ability to have enough cognitive awareness to be able to meet your own ADLs. And if you don't have that cognitive awareness, you need someone to help you meet your ADLs, then you will also be able to pass the test for Medicaid. And Medicaid actually has these series of rules that they use to create that test that you can actually see and look at. And so if you have someone that you think might be, at the mobility standard, might not be, and you're concerned about that, there are rules out there that you can actually get the copy of, and you can read exactly what the caseworkers are looking at to determine that question. So you have to pass that test before you can get on to Medicaid. And most people do because it's pretty clear. But occasionally we had a case that's just really close. But once you're actually in long-term care and you need long-term care outside the home, it's more likely that you're going to pass those tests because you have significant needs. When they changed the standard from level 17 to 13, what they really did was kick a lot of people off of Medicaid who are at home, not a lot of people that were already in long-term care outside the home. So you really have to look at those tests if you think this person is borderline with those things. Now, again, you only have to pass one of those tests. You don't have to pass all of them. So just one thing, mobility, or one thing, elimination, or one thing, eating, or one thing, cognition, will get you there. Okay? I know that's kind of a difficult piece, but and it's kind of confusing for a lot of people, but it's an important piece. The second test for Medicaid is the first financial test. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it is kind of long-winded and takes some time. But it is referred to in the business as the income cap. And so Medicaid has a very strange rule that should never have been on the books. I remember when it started back in the early 90s, where Medicaid says if your monthly income, the person who's applying for Medicaid's monthly income, exceeds a certain level of gross income, and right now that's $2,382 a month of gross income. So if the person applying for Medicaid makes more than that, they are technically not eligible for Medicaid. And when that rule first came into place, we actually were placing people in Washington, Idaho, and California just to get them on to Medicaid. But fortunately, now we have a legal tool, a document called an income cap trust that lets us get people on Medicaid even though their income is too high. And this is a tool that actually started in Colorado and passed several federal challenges and court cases. And so ultimately, the federal government Medicaid rules adopted this income cap trust as a viable tool. And when that happened, a number of us attorneys, including myself, went to Salem and we said, Oregon, you have to do this, and said, we agree. And so it has been part of the structure since then. Now, what you just heard me say was Oregon has this rule that says if you have too much income, you're not eligible for Medicaid. And then they have this rule that says, but if you're not eligible for Medicaid because of that, you can do this trust and now you're eligible, which is total insanity if you think about it. But that's the way it is. And the caseworkers hate this. We do too, even though we get paid to help people to create that. But we'd love to get rid of it. But for some reason, Salem, somewhere, in the legislature, they think that somehow this is still cost effective. And so we still have that piece. So the takeaway there is don't let anybody tell you that you can't get on Medicaid because the person's income is too high. That's never the case at all. Okay? So that's test number 2. First was healthcare. Second is the income cap. The third test is the most important one, and that is assets, especially for a married couple. So the third financial test is the assets of the person applying or the assets of a couple. Because remember before we said if it's a single person, we're looking at their assets only, but if it's a couple, we're looking at the assets of the couple together. And so let's just start with a single person. A single person applying for Medicaid still has to pass the health care test that we just talked about. They still have to pass the income cap test that we talked about. And then the third test for them is assets. And actually, this is a fairly easy one, although it's it's hard to be able to realize that you're going to have to spend all of your assets. If you're a single person, you're going to have to spend all of your assets down to $2,000. So this is often where you hear about Medicaid being kind of compared to a welfare program. And for a single person, it truly is. The philosophy of the federal government and the state of Oregon is that we will take care of this single person, but we're not going to preserve an inheritance for someone else. And a lot of people believe that's an appropriate philosophy. Where you're at in that, doesn't matter. That's the rule. So for a single person, the state of Oregon, the federal government will step in and provide good quality care for you for the rest of your lifetime once you have spent all your assets. By the way, let me just do a quick aside. Don't let anybody ever tell you that the quality of your care is affected by whether you are on Medicaid or not. That is absolutely not true. Again, I've been doing this for 40 years. I believe that that's absolutely not true. Also, the interesting part about it is there's more monitoring of the care needs of clients who are on Medicaid than there are private pay patients, because you have a Medicaid caseworker assigned to that person and cares about the quality of their care. You also have the long-term care ombudsman's program checking in on the quality of care and there to respond for quality of care issues for Medicaid patients in care facilities. And hopefully you have a family or friends that are doing it as well. So don't let anybody ever tell you that. We used to hear it a lot when people were selling long-term care insurance policies, trying to make people afraid to ever get onto Medicaid. There's no reason that you should have to be afraid of the quality of care. So back to our third test for a single person. He or she must spend their assets down to $2,000 before they're eligible for Medicaid. Now, if they drive a car and use it, they can keep that car. If they're living in their home and getting services and applying for Medicaid services in their home does not have to be sold until the day comes when they can no longer live there. Okay? So, but other than that, they're spending all their bank accounts, investments, stocks, bonds, and annuities, real estate, property that they're not living in. They're selling all of that before they're eligible for Medicaid. Now, let's say just quickly for an example that they have a house, but they've now moved into long-term care and they need to get on Medicaid right away because all they had was a house. We can actually get them onto Medicaid then, and then just proceed to sell the house. And when we sell the house, they go off of Medicaid and use those proceeds. And then when those proceeds are used up, they can go back onto Medicaid later. So there's always ways to get around that piece if necessary. Okay. So that is the 3 tests for a single person. It is healthcare test, income test, and asset test, which is down to $2,000. It is the same 3 tests for a couple, but the asset test is completely, totally different. So if you have a couple, and let's say one of the spouses needs to go into long-term care, they still have to pass the health care test. They still have to pass the income test. So if there's income is too high, we have to do that income cap trust. But the final test is assets. And assets for a couple is a much more complicated calculation. And the reason for it is good, because the state and federal government want to make sure that that spouse at home, and Medicaid actually calls that person the community spouse, because they're living in the community, not in an institution. That community spouse, the state of Oregon, federal government want to make sure that he or she have financial protections to keep them from becoming impoverished. There's a whole separate section of the Medicaid code called the Spousal Impoverishment Provisions. Literally, that's the label of the paragraph. Keep the spouse from becoming impoverished. And it's all about giving that spouse a number of financial protections. And that's what we're going to go through next. And I'm going to start off by basically talking about what those protections look like. And I like to start it off by saying, here is the worst case scenario that would happen for a spouse. And then we're going to talk about how we can make that even a little bit better. This is also where we start throwing out some numbers, and it starts getting a little bit more complicated, but I think you guys will be fine. And again, if you have questions about it, just post them, Cassie, and we'll be glad to answer those questions as we go through. So what's happening is the state of Oregon is going to say, we want this spouse to have certain financial protections. And let's just create a scenario here for us to talk about. Let's say we have a couple that own a house, okay? And they own one car, and they have about $200,000 in a bank or an annuity or an IRA or stocks or bonds or the cash value of life insurance. So what they own in this world is a house and a car, and they've got $200,000 in the bank. Let's just say that, make it simple, okay? So what Medicaid's going to do for this spouse who says, well, I need to place my other spouse into long-term care, I need to apply for Medicaid, they would say to her, I understand, here's how we're going to help him and you, or her and you, and here's what protections we're going to give for that community spouse that's at home. The first protection, the biggest protection in most cases, is the home. That house will be available for that community spouse to use for the rest of her lifetime. It will never be used for the other spouses in long-term care expenses at all while the community spouse is living. And so the important piece there is that that community spouse can use that home, can live in that home, can sell that home, and then buy another home, or sell that home and put the money in a bank account and rent somewhere for the rest of his or her lifetime. And so for many people, that's a $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 asset that spouse gets to keep to use for the rest of her lifetime or his lifetime. And if when he or she dies and they've spent all of that money from that house, then that's just fine. It's all for that community spouse to use if they can. If when they die, there's some money left from that house or that estate, there are rules that say that Medicaid can come back and potentially get some of that money back. That is the most complicated part of the Medicaid rules right now that are constantly changing. And if we have time, we'll talk about that. It's called estate recovery. But now I want you to just focus on this eligibility piece, because this is what you need to know right now. So first and biggest protection for spouse is the house. The next three are kind of small pieces. The spouse gets to keep one car, and it's honestly one car of any value. Okay, so that's an important protection. They get to keep All of personal possessions. Medicaid doesn't care about your personal possessions or the amount of your personal possessions. Now, if you have a Picasso on the wall, if you have a whole bunch of gold and silver coins, if you have valuable collections that you have as an investment, then Medicaid would look at that as an asset. But overall, they don't care about the piano and the baby shoes and small stamp collection or something like that. So personal possessions are basically not counted and therefore given to that community spouse. And then the next important one is the monthly income of that spouse at home. So Medicaid is going to give that spouse at home all of his or her monthly income that they get coming into them personally every month. So that spouse could be bringing in $5,000 or even $10,000 a month from their own monthly income streams. I had one gentleman who had a monthly income of $20,000 a month because he owned 1/10 of a big ship at sea. And that was the money that was brought in every month from his share of that ship. It's highest I've ever seen. But a lot of people have pensions and think PERS or federal pensions or things that are significant income. So that spouse at home, that community spouse, gets to keep all of his or her monthly income that comes to them each month. On the flip side, if they don't have enough monthly income, Medicaid is going to give them some of their spouse's income to bring them on to a certain protected level. And roughly right now, that's about $2,200 a month. It's not a lot. Remember, I said this is kind of worst case scenario. It's not a lot, but they would make sure that spouse at least has that. And if they have a house and other household expenses, that amount could go up even as high as $3,600 a month. So there are things that we can do to make sure that spouse is getting enough income as well. So let's recap. Medicaid's going to give her the house, the one car, personal possessions, their monthly income stream. Oh, by the way, if you go ahead and prepay a burial plan for both of you, then that's also exempt. That doesn't count as an asset. Now, last but not least, and this is the most kind of important exception other than the house, it's called the Spousal Resource Allowance. Now, remember, this couple that we have a house, they have $200,000 of money in the bank and a car. So we know the house is protected. We know the car is protected. So what happens with the $200,000? And here's how that works. Medicaid is going to give that spouse at home a certain amount of that cash. In our example here, they would get 1/2 of it. So the spouse at home would get $100,000 of cash for her to use for her benefit, not used for his care for the rest of her lifetime. That money is hers to keep. Now, remember, we're going to talk in a minute about how we can do even better than that. But right now, for this couple, the best case scenario for the spouse at home is the house, one car, personal possessions, burial fund if you have it, all of her already monthly income, or at least $2,200 a month coming in of income, and for this couple, $100,000 of assets. That's bottom line. It would never get worse than that for that couple. Now, you probably hear a lot of people telling you how this works and giving you ideas about what Medicaid will look like for you. But I told you those numbers because those were the exact figures for this imaginary couple we're talking about. Change the amount of the house, change the mortgage on the house, change the income amount, change the asset amount, and it all fluctuates. So no one can really tell you how it works for you unless you sit down with somebody who can look at all of your particular numbers, just like an accountant looks at your tax numbers so they can do your tax return. Nobody can really tell what is going to happen for you until they see your exact numbers. Let's say this couple had $400,000 of assets. Well, now she gets to keep $130,000 of assets, and they and the rest has to be spent, which is where we're going next. So, or let's say that you only have $26,000 of assets in a house. Well, you're automatically eligible for Medicaid. So it's all about the numbers. But what I want you to know is that for this couple that we're talking about, there are some significant protections: house, car, personal possessions, income stream, and $100,000. Bottom line, never gets worse than that. So that's the first piece. That's Medicaid 101, if you will. So let's say that this couple goes to apply for Medicaid and they walk in the door and Medicaid says, yes, he passes our health care test. Yes, he passes our income test. And now you as a couple, we're going to give $100,000 to this spouse. Now there's this other $100,000 out there. Medicaid then tells you, you must now spend that $100,000, that other $100,000, you must spend it down to $2,000 because that's how much he's allowed to have to go on to Medicaid. So Medicaid, of course, would tell you, so go and pay for his care privately. And by the way, I use his all the time. I'm not trying to be sexist, but I always, it's more often the guys, and so I always pick on them who are going into long-term care. Obviously not always true, but I always pick on the guys. So that's why I use the word his. So you must spend that other $100,000 down to $2,000 before he can go onto Medicaid. And Medicaid, of course, would love you to be spending it on his care. So yes, you are, as soon as you're paying a check to a care facility, or you're paying for in-home care services, and it's starting to deplete your assets, then you are spending down already to that $2,000. However, what Medicaid may not tell you, and this is worth the price of admission right here, is that you can also spend that other $100,000 on the community spouse for her benefit or his benefit, depending on the situation. So what does that mean? Well, let's give you some examples. The community spouse could take that other $100,000 and spend it to pay down the mortgage on the house. If the house has got a mortgage of $100,000 or more, you could cut a check to the mortgage company for $100,000 and he would instantly be eligible for Medicaid. You could take that money and fix up the house. You could literally sell your current house, add that $100,000 and buy a new house if you wanted to. Not a lot of clients want to do that, but that's an option. You could buy a car with that money. You could fix up the house with that money. You could buy furniture with that money. You could take a trip with that money, as long as you spend it on yourself. You could buy a burial fund. You can buy other things you need, personal possessions. I had a client who bought a $5,000 diamond ring because she never had one and decided she wanted one. She lived frugally her entire lifetime. You can buy things, of course, for the spouse who's in long-term care, things they might need, a custom bed, a custom chair, special devices, those things that Medicaid might not cover for them once they're eligible for Medicaid. So all of those things you can do. And so for some people, well, it sounds like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose $100,000. I have to spend it on his care. The answer is no. That community spouse, and often the majority of the time, we're finding ways that she can spend that for herself, to make sure that she's protected as well. So all of and by the way, this is all really conservative stuff. This is not some legal loophole that does or does not work or is likely challenged. We do this kind of planning with Medicaid literally every day. We have a great relationship with the Medicaid caseworker. So none of this, you need to think, well, this might not work for me. It can work for you if you're in that situation. There's one more little piece I want to throw out too, before we get to some of these other pieces, because we're kind of coming up on our hour and we want to leave it open for questions. There's another piece that's available, and I don't want to really get into it because it's kind of highly complex. The one thing you can't do with this $100,000 is you can't give it away. Okay, Medicaid's not going to allow you to give it to somebody. You can't even give it to charity without making yourself ineligible for Medicaid. By the way, if you've given anything away in the past 5 years before going on to Medicaid, you really want to have somebody review that with you because that might or might not harm the Medicaid application. So that's something you want to talk about. But you can't take from this 100,000 you need to spend. You can't give it away to somebody. You can't go invest it somewhere else either, with one exception. There is a tool called the Single Premium Immediate Annuity. You don't write that down. But basically what you're doing with this particular kind of investment is you're giving, let's say, the $100,000 to a highly rated insurance company, and you're kind of loaning it to an insurance company like Standard or Nationwide, and they pay you back monthly, your principal and interest, kind of like you pay on your mortgage to your house. They pay you back that once a month for the rest of your lifetime. And so what you've done is you've taken a chunk of cash and you've turned it into an irrevocable pension plan for the community spouse. So we can increase her monthly income by doing that. And then she's getting the entire benefit of that $100,000 coming back to her during her lifetime. And again, it's him also. I'm again just picking on the guy. So that's another thing. Now, that works for some clients really well. For other clients, it does not. But it is one way to spin this money down that truly helps that spouse as well. So it's complicated, but we're doing it all the time. It is an option that's available. There's some downsides, which mean one is it's irrevocable. So once you put the money into this investment, you don't get it out. It's locked into that. And number two, when you die, if there's any money left in it, whatever's left in it goes back either to your spouse or to the state Medicaid program. But again, it's based on your life expectancy, so hopefully it's there for you for the rest of your lifetime. So that's a lot of stuff to throw at you. Hopefully, though, you're getting a sense that if you're a couple especially, there are some things that we can do to protect that spouse at home, to provide some financial protections, things you may not have heard about, things that Medicaid has not told you. Medicaid workers aren't trying to hide things from you, but they just don't have enough time to be able to explain all these things to you. The good ones will send you to attorneys like us or other people that could assist you in working through that system. So that's all an option. We talked a little bit about estate recovery, and again, basically there are rules that say when the community spouse passes away, if there's money left in that person's estate, the state of Oregon might be able to get paid back from that, but then again, they might not. So that leads me to one thing I want to cover for sure. If you're facing a long-term care situation or you think you may be in the not too distant future, you guys want to do some estate planning, and that are at least wills, maybe trusts, and absolutely powers of attorney. The good news about this Medicaid planning stuff we just talked about is you don't have to go out and buy a house. You don't have to go out and buy an annuity. You don't have to split up your assets. You don't have to do any of those things until you're actually facing placement or facing having to cut a large check to somebody for care services. Before that, you don't have to do any of those things that I just talked to you about. Those can all be done within a month or two before you're getting ready to apply for Medicaid. So that's really a good thing. You don't have to go out and do anything big right now. But the one thing I really would like you to do, especially as a couple, but also for a single person, is go out and make a power of attorney. Power of attorney is a legal document that says, if I become incapacitated, cognitively impaired, that this person I appoint, my spouse, my partner, my significant other, my parent, my, whoever it is, this person has the power to make financial decisions for me. So right there, a single person should absolutely have that, but every couple should have it as well. And if you're a married couple, I want you to go a little bit further. I want you to, because we want to implement these spousal protections we talked about. I want you to go further by having in that power of attorney what we attorneys call gifting and transfer provisions. And what they basically say is this: I give my spouse the authority to transfer assets out of my name into her name. Again, picking on the guy. So let me explain that. I could give Cassie right now a power of attorney for me. And that power of attorney says that she has the ability to manage my money for my benefit, and that she can spend my money and invest my money and use my money for my benefit for the rest of my lifetime. I can always revoke that power of attorney anytime if I don't like what Cassie's doing. But if I become incapacitated, she can kick in and she will handle it from then on. Okay? But what she can't do by law is she can't take my money out of my name, my house out of my name, and give it to herself. That's a breach of her duty as a fiduciary. She could be sued for that. But that's exactly what we want a married couple to be able to do. So these gifting and transfer provisions are specifically a part of a power of attorney. You won't find it in an internet form. You won't find it with a Stephen's Nest form. You want to go to an attorney who understands what I'm saying about gifting and transfer provisions in your power of attorney. And you want language that says, my spouse can take this house out of my name and put it in her name if she needs to. My spouse can take this bank account, take my name off of it and put it in her name, or this investment, she can liquidate it and put the money in her name. And that saves us so much time and so much money when we're now getting into that month or two before we have to go into long-term care by having that document in place. And yes, I also want you to have a will. And if you have a larger estate, you should absolutely be thinking about a revocable living trust as part of your estate planning. Now, let me up that a little bit as well. If you're starting to face long-term care expenses, you may very well want to change your existing plan with the understanding that your spouse who's going into care is not who you would want to leave your assets to if you died before him. And we could talk about that at some point in time in the future as well if you have questions about that. But if you know that you're facing long-term care in the not too distant future, you may very well want to change a plan that leaves everything to the surviving spouse to potentially change that, because once he gets into long-term care on Medicaid, it's not going to do any good to anybody except the state of Oregon. And I'm all for the state of Oregon and the federal government, but except, you can leave that money to your kids to some extent when you die, and that's the best planning to do. So if you already have an existing will that says you're leaving it to each other, or an existing revocable living trust that says you're leaving it to each other, and you're facing long-term care in the not too distant future, you should talk to a good attorney who handles these kind of issues and say, what should I do to change that planning? Right, I threw a lot of stuff at you here.